Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, we'll take a look at the June crop report with Elaine Kub. Cheryl Burkhart-Kriesel shows how some rural Nebraska towns use agritourism. Brad Lubben discusses conservation programs. And Lowell Sandell talks about weed resistance. In the coming weeks, you'll see coverage from our time in a country with exceptional importance to U.S. agriculture, China. Curtis and I will show you our reporting from there when we return. But due to our travel schedule, we asked our friend Doug Jost to fill in this week's market analysis.
It's great to be back and fill in this week when Jeff is out of the country on assignment. My guest this week is Elaine Kub from ARC Consulting. And Elaine, it's good to visit with you again.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Let's talk about what's happening in the grain markets. There was a crop report came out this week. Give us a little summary of what happened. Pretty much same old story?
Well, they didn't make any big changes, which was sort of surprising, I think, to some of the market in the sense that they didn't change any yields, for instance, and we know that this has been a very dry spring. We had a dry winter, so we don't have a lot of subsoil moisture, and there are certain areas of the Corn Belt specifically that are really starting to suffer and are starting to see, crop failures in some fields, let's say in northern Indiana, but just crop stress on a wide swath of the Corn Belt. So you would kind of expect to see, or you would feel as a farmer or as an agronomist, that there will probably be lower yields in a big part of the Corn Belt. And yet the USDA in June, in their June report, that'd be really early for them to make any sort of changes. So the market trades on these big numbers, a 166 bushel per acre projected average yield, which seems very large at this point. But that's what the market traded on, and so we had a bearish reaction for corn on Tuesday after the crop report, and a bullish reaction for soybeans because they did tweak the ending stocks for soybeans even tighter. So we're at 4.3% stocks to use ratio, which is very, very tight inventory situation.
Talking about that, how did the South American crop come in? Is that feeding into this tight stock situation?
Yes, that's the primary reason why the soybean stocks to use ratio has been cut, but that's been the case for a couple of months now. So that's not new information. It's just trading on more of that. And the reason that it got tweaked lower for the U.S. domestic stocks to use in this past report was because they adjusted the old crop ending stocks a little lower, which means that we've been crushing a considerable number of soybeans.
What's happening out there on a day-to-day market basis in terms of the cash markets? First for corn.
Well, it's been really interesting. On a day-to-day basis in the futures market, we've been reacting almost exclusively to the outside markets, to the dollar, to the Europe. We have investors that just don't want to be in any sort of risky market, and commodities are a risky market.
Right.
So we have people who don't want to be involved in that on a day when you're concerned about the European banking situation or when the U.S. dollar goes up. So that's been driving down futures prices quite a bit while the dollar's been going up and a bounce when the dollar stays off of its high. But in the cash market, that's not reality. We really are short. We really are short on old crop corn, for instance, and so we have situations of record high, unseasonably strong cash basis levels compared to the futures price.
So will that continue till we see a new crop come into the elevators?
Well, it's a really tricky situation for elevators right now because they have to make their basis bids off of the July contract, which is
Right.
really the only remaining old crop futures contract, because September contract is being treated as a new crop futures contract. So July is going to go off the board or go into delivery in the next couple of weeks. But you don't want to be holding a short July futures contract and have to deliver on a futures price when the actual grain is worth 50 or 70 cents more than that futures contract. So now we have a situation where there's a very volatile July futures contract, makes it very hard for elevators to be putting together a bid. And you know, if farmers are hedging their old crop against the July futures contract, they also have to be really aware of how volatile basis or how volatile that July contract is going to be for the rest of the month. And you certainly, I wouldn't want to be in it in the beginning of July when it's in delivery.
So if people are cleaning out their bins, getting ready for the new crop, check day to day to see what's going on at their elevator?
Absolutely. Be very, very conscious of the basis changes and the overall cash price, because that's what you're going to be looking for, yeah.
Soybeans, as you mentioned, we do have tight supplies there. What does that look like the rest of the summer?
Well, you know, on their own, you could say this is a bullish market. It's a very tight supply and demand situation, but really that's the market that responds more than any other to the investors' reaction to the dollar or to Europe. And so as far as the price outlook, it's really hard to say. You know, we have an election coming up in Greece this weekend that will give some guidance to how stable the European situation might be. We have a federal open markets committee could put some more money in and really grease up these commodity markets over the short term. So there are a number of things that could happen in either direction to be very volatile for prices.
Thanks, Doug. Next week, we'll take a look at cattle markets with Mike Briggs. At the Rural Futures Conference in May, we talked about how the University of Nebraska was leading an effort to strengthen rural communities in the Great Plains. One way some towns have gained an advantage has been through agritourism. While at the conference here in Lincoln, we talked with Cheryl Burkhart-Kriesel, a UNL Extension specialist in entrepreneurship and business development, about the history of agritourism in the state.
Well, I think it's always sort of been there, but maybe in kind of a background way. And there's just more and more effort and more emphasis. People have resources that others want to see. I think what really kind of sparked things is for Nebraskans, they've realized that a lot of people come in for the sandhill cranes. And so that gives them an opportunity to think of, gosh, well, I have all kinds of other opportunities on my land. Would people be interested? And they are. So that kind of gives kind of a spark to thinking about your resources in a little bit different way.
Yeah, the cranes are unique. I mean, you have to find something unique, right?
Right.
So how does each individual area find something unique or something that people want to come see or do?
Well, I think agricultural producers, there's a lot of private land, of course, and there's also public land, but on the private land, there's an opportunity for unique opportunities, species, ecosystems. One of the benefits of being in Nebraska is we have such diversity across the state from east to west. And then I think as producers look at their farm and ranch, they're looking at it in different ways. It's not just for ranching maybe or crop production. There's opportunities for diversifying their profit centers. So one way might be to do that, to get started, might be to do some leasing. Now, actually leasing land for hunting has been done for a long time, but now really people are looking at, well, I could lease my land for maybe there's somebody in the area that wants to bring visitors in to just look at some of the things, whether it be in my area, I'm in Scotts Bluff, it might be pronghorn antelope, it might be even prairie dogs, it might be some of the wildflowers, it might be the whole package. So producers really have that opportunity to think about it in a different way.
How can you stick your foot in the water, so to speak, and say, well, I don't know if people would be interested in seeing this or doing this? How can you sort of test it out or maybe advertise in some ways to find out?
Right. Well, I think, during the wintertime gives you the opportunity to think about a lot of different things, and maybe one of the best ways is for an agriculture producer actually to talk to another producer, whether it be in his area or in another region of the state, that's actually doing it and maybe getting started. That gives him some of the ideas of sort of what are those considerations that I need to think about for my operation, because sometimes it may not be the right time. And maybe you just want to get started a little bit. I mean, there'd be all kinds of different levels of involvement. Some of our agriculture producers have gotten into agritourism in a big way and have actually put on housing on their operation, or worked with another producer and cooperate. Maybe he has the housing and maybe the other one has the resources. So there's just a lot of ways, a lot of packages to get involved. And I think talking to somebody who's doing it, maybe going to some conferences. There's also great resources through the Division of Tourism, and then I'm available too if people want to just kind of talk through some ideas. And so through Extension, the university, through other sources, that's one way to kind of get the ball rolling.
What importance is the Department of Economic Development placing on or agritourism? Excuse me.
Well, one of the interesting things is a year or two ago they did a real comprehensive study in the state of Nebraska looking at where would be those industry clusters that have a lot of potential. And in some ways, not surprising, tourism was one of those clusters. And so they're really looking at now how to really take some of that tourism effort that's already here and really well established and being pretty successful. How can we take it to the kind of that next level? And so I think there's some opportunities to think about it in a different way, collaborate in a different way, maybe put packages together. People are wanting to do things and see things. It's an evolution, and so the providers need to also evolve with what the customer wants.
And do the businesses look at this as every bit helps for the rural communities?
Oh, absolutely. If you think about it on the tourism piece, it's one of those fundamentally clean industries that can provide some basics to the community, and when that person comes into community, they're going to the filling station, they're using the restaurant, probably the grocery store, and everybody benefits, and there couldn't be anything better.
At the Rural Futures Conference, we also talked with Steve Waller, the Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources here at UNL. On the heels of the largest graduating class from the college, Waller says there must be opportunities in rural areas to keep graduates local.
The biggest challenge for the rural future, particularly in Nebraska at this stage, is to have employment opportunities for our graduates so that they can have an income that allows them to have the quality of life and raise families. Those communities have to have good school systems, good health care, and so there's an infrastructure around the success of rural communities that will take graduates from all colleges, all universities within the state, 2- and 4-year programs as well. So the challenge is on one end to have the community vibrant enough to attract the graduates. The other is for our graduates to participate in developing that vibrant community. So we're very much about entrepreneurship now and trying to get some of our graduates to consider staying in state, starting businesses that will add employment opportunities, add economic stability to communities that they want to live in, have their families grow in. And it's an exciting time, but it's not one that is going to be solved by any one component of our society.
Waller says groups, including the university and its graduates, communities, and industries, need to work together to enhance and maintain rural communities. It was January 2010 when Bayer, Crop Science, Ag, and UNL signed an agreement to improve wheat breeding and generate new wheat varieties. Now, as you'll read in the June Nebraska Farmer, Bayer has chosen a Nebraska site for its first North American wheat breeding station. The location is near Goner in Seward County. Bayer announced an agreement to lease 400 acres there with an option to purchase the site later. The June Nebraska Farmer explains how Bayer will gain access to UNL's wheat germplasm, although the agreement allows both Bayer and UNL to improve their respective wheat breeding programs. Perhaps lost in the popular debate over the next Farm Bill is the discussion on conservation programs. While much of the attention goes to crop insurance, direct payments, and safety nets, there are other changes that could affect farmers. UNL Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben talked with us at the beginning of the month about the background, format, and outlook of conservation programs.
Well, it's interesting if we look at the conservation programs. They become a major part of the Farm Bill and the Farm Bill debate because they've grown substantially over the last 25 years. From less than $250 million of annual spending 25 years ago to somewhere between $3 and $4 billion of payments sent to producers each year for programs like the CRP or the EQIP and the CSP programs that pay producers to essentially adopt and maintain good conservation.
Let's talk about those programs. Just give me a brief synopsis of what each of those programs does.
Right. Well, essentially think of conservation programs in a basket of 3 types. There are retirement programs like the CRP that essentially takes land out of production and puts it into some conservation use. The Conservation Reserve, the Wetlands Reserve, originally took that land out of production in part to reduce crop production and excess supplies, but over time they've become primarily an environmental targeted goal, how to achieve certain conservation benefits. A second category is working lands. EQIP and CSP fit that category. Substantial growth in the last 10 to 15 years in both programs, growth that pays producers to adopt and maintain good practices on their land that continues to work or continues to be in production. A third category is the preservation programs, programs that pay producers to lock up in perpetuity land in its current use, whether that's wetlands that are preserved forever as wetlands, grassland, or just the farmland protection program, which keeps land in ag and out of some non-farm development.
As you've mentioned, two things here. There's a growth in spending, and these are voluntary programs, so we're increasing spending
Right.
to pay out to volunteers who are coming forward for these programs.
Right.
Now, in the scope of this Farm Bill, why are we looking at cutting these programs?
Well, they're clearly popular. They're clearly very popular and growing. And as I mentioned, the growth over the last 25 years has been substantial. They are big enough to also be a budget target, with everything being a target these days in Washington. Even conservation spending has to face some of the challenges. Now, they're forecast at upwards of $64 billion per year, or $64 billion in spending over the next 10 years. That's better than $6 billion a year. The proposal that sits in the Senate floor as we go to debate would cut that back about $6 billion, maybe perhaps closer to $58 billion. Well, it is a 10% cut, but it's also just a reduced rate of growth. It's not specifically pulling back on things we've accomplished. It's reducing the growth of those programs into the future.
Right, I should clarify, not cutting the programs, but cutting spending within the programs.
Predominantly cutting growth, not cutting the programs,
Right.
and not even cutting back on the amount of spending in the program, but cutting back on the rate of growth in the program.
How do you think farmers feel about this and the potential for it going
Right.
forward?
Well, clearly farmers have valued conservation programs and see it as a major part of that farm program portfolio. In fact, it's as big as the commodity program is today in terms of expected dollars of spending, and we're seeing proposed cuts to the commodity programs that would make, in fact, conservation the bigger part of that portfolio. Even still, farmers prefer the voluntary programs over the alternatives. You have compliance programs, essentially require producers to adopt certain conservation practices or maintain those practices as a requirement for other benefits. Or you even have direct regulation, which predominantly involves other agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, on directly addressing those environmental issues in agriculture.
Again, the current Farm Bill is slated to run through September. The latest numbers from the EPA show the U.S. biodiesel industry produced 94.5 million gallons in April. That brings year-to-date production to 331 million gallons and means the industry would set a new production record of 1.3 billion gallons this year if the pace holds. As we've reported here in the past, biodiesel can not only be used to fuel vehicles, but also heat homes when used in the form of bioheat. In a Chicago Tribune article last month, Paul Nazaro from the National Biodiesel Board told the crowd at the Mid-Atlantic Energy Conference that he expects to see an 18 to 20% mix of biofuel in home heating oil in the next 18 months to 2 years. Terry Horkey, a producer from Sargent and director with the Nebraska Soybean Board, says the passion for biodiesel in New York and the Northeast is also beneficial for producers here at home.
They're very excited, which is good for the environment, and then how often they use it, year-round. That's a huge deal to be using biodiesel year-round. I see it as if we're selling bean in that case, mostly the oil, but that helps bring the price of the meal down for the livestock. So as long as the oil's getting used somewhere, that helps out the producers.
Last year, the biodiesel industry produced nearly 1.1 billion gallons. At the beginning of June, UNL Weed Science Extension educator Lowell Sandell said producers were having trouble controlling mare's tail in Nebraska fields. The concern was that due to the weed's resistance, it was becoming difficult to control. In July, UNL will be holding field days to discuss the history and importance of weed resistance in Nebraska and the country. We talked with Lowell about why this issue is now getting more attention.
Weed resistance, or more specifically glyphosate resistant weeds, have been a pretty big topic across the southern United States and in a large portion of the Midwest. Nebraska has been somewhat spared, but I think we're starting to catch up with the rest of the country. These field days are sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board, and we think it's a really important topic for soybean producers to keep an eye on. And we've talked about mare's tail, but we've also seen glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed and glyphosate-resistant kochia develop in the state. And before these populations get too far out of hand, we think some educational efforts are needed for the ag community here in Nebraska.
What's the backstory behind why these weeds are becoming so resistant? Farmers just continuing to stay on the same discipline, same program?
Yeah, well, for a lot of reasons, folks have chosen to rely primarily on glyphosate, and that has worked well for a number of years. But when you rely so heavily on a single tool or a single mode of action for control, eventually nature will push back a little bit, and we're seeing that in the form of glyphosate resistant weeds developing here in the state.
What advice do you give to farmers then, and what will you be talking about at these field days to show what options farmers have?
Yeah, diversity is the key. We've talked about integrated weed management for many years, and just diversifying the tactics, which is more than just spraying herbicides. A diversity of herbicides is good crop rotation, good cultural practices, on top of diversifying your herbicide mode of action or use in crops. So that's kind of the message that we're going to have. We're going to have some live or some field plots that we hope will demonstrate some of these concepts and get across to producers just how difficult some of these weeds can be to control when we've lost one of our primary tools, such as glyphosate, for adequate control.
The Weed Resistant Management Field Days will be held in Big Springs on July 11th and David City on July 12th. The program is free to attend and sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board. Participants are, however, encouraged to register by July 6th, so plans can be made for teaching resources and meals. And now, as we look ahead at the next week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension statewide climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again. It's time for the weekly forecast. But before we get to the direct forecast, let's take a look at what's happened over the last week. Of course, we had the frontal boundary that moved through on Sunday that did generate some isolated thunderstorms, especially as you got into extreme southeastern Nebraska and around the Omaha metropolitan area. And then we had that cool down. And when as the warm air started to build toward the east, we did see some precipitation break out from southwest to northeast Nebraska. During the Tuesday afternoon time frame, precipitation totals were fairly light. And then, of course, with that front slowly moving toward the east and the accumulation of heat and moisture, we did finally break the cap, so to speak, as we got into Thursday and then again yesterday with thunderstorm development, particularly over the eastern half of the state, and very welcome moisture. In terms of the drought, we have seen another northward expansion of the drought area from Kansas, now incorporating all of the southern tier counties of Nebraska in what we would consider moderate drought conditions, with the possibility that we'll have to upgrade some areas to severe if we return to some very dry weather here in the future. And of course, the panhandle, that dryness area is expanding eastward, and abnormally dry conditions cover almost the entire state outside of northeastern Nebraska. Now, as we go forward in time, we'll be looking at these frontal boundaries working into our region. We need to see this precipitation because the long-range models are indicating a very warm and dry pattern establish itself as we get toward the end of next week. Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we go through this next 7-day period. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the piece of energy that was responsible for our cold front is now moving toward our east. So for today, we are going to expect pretty much highs in the lower 80s to maybe the upper 80s across extreme southern Nebraska. And we'll be looking for another wave coming in from the northwest, and it's going to slowly again move toward the northern plains. So we do have chances of precipitation, and the Sunday time frame is probably going to be more across the northern part of the state, closer to this frontal boundary. We'll be looking at highs that will be primarily in the upper 80s to in the northeast, and as you get towards southern Nebraska, we may be looking at some places getting up close to the mid-90s. Now as we go into Monday, we're going to notice the front comes a little bit closer, so chances of thunderstorm activity increase, particularly over northwest and north central Nebraska, more isolated across portions of eastern and southeastern Nebraska. Temperatures will remain in the mid-80s across the north to the mid-90s across the south. As we get to Tuesday, more energy moves in, so there's a better chance across the western half of the state of thunderstorm activity. We're looking at highs somewhere in the low 80s across the northwest, closer to the frontal boundary, and in the south and southeast, we'll be looking at 90s to mid-90s for high temperatures. Now as we go to Wednesday, now we see the push of the cold air coming into our region, and we should start to see some pretty significant thunderstorm development if the moisture is in place. We're looking at highs in the northwest in the upper 70s to the low 90s across south central and southeastern Nebraska. By the time we get to Thursday, the front starts to push through. We get this cool air into our region. We're looking at highs in the mid-70s to the north to the low 80s across the south, and as we get into Friday, all of a sudden the warm temperatures come in. Temperatures jump up to the low 80s north to the low 90s south. 8 to 14-day forecast indicates above normal temperatures coming into the region, and in terms of precipitation, a very dry trend establishes itself.
Thanks, Al. A reminder as we move through the crop growing season, if you see something in one of your fields and want to ask a UNL expert about it, you can take a picture through the Market Journal mobile app on your smartphone. Once we receive the picture, we'll try to answer the question on the next week's show. As I mentioned, in the coming weeks, you'll see video and interviews from our time in China as we explore the importance of agriculture between that country and this one. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.